Cleisthenes, and Attica, regional parties in 6th century Athens. Let us begin by sketching our evidence for regional divisions in Athenian politics before Cleisthenes reforms. The parties of the 560s have regional names, acquired, we are told, from the places where they farmed. We should emphasize that parties may include members from outside the original area of the nucleus. When Pisistratus waited at Marathon in 546, supporters came to him from Athens itself, as well as from the country villages. This should also act as a warning against any easy assignment of single economic or even constitutional motives to a party. The party may be a complex of driving forces held together by its leader. Such a complex is in fact sketched for Pisistratus' party by Aristotle. However, even with these qualifications in mind, it is legitimate to look for the nuclei. The Pedii are relatively straightforward. None will doubt that their nucleus is in the plain of Athens itself, not indeed the whole of it, for we shall see reason to exclude the area south and southeast of the city, but at least the more substantial portion to the north and west. Support for this comes from the name of their leader, Lycurgus. The chances are high that he, like the later prominent men of the name, came from Budadai, a little to the west of the city. No other family can be confidently associated with this party, but one may be tempted to go back to Myron of Phlia, prosecutor of the Alcmaeonids, for their action against the Cylonian conspiracy. He will have come from the northeast of the Pedion. The Paralioi may best be located by looking for Alcmaeonid land. Alcmaeonids are found in 3 dems, Alopec, Agrile, and Zypete, all to the south and southeast of the city. They farm the land which goes down towards the coast, and will thus have got their name. 2 other families are to be associated. The principal family of the Keraikes, headed in this period by Callias, son of Phinippus, is attested as notably anti-tyrant by Herodotus. After many wanderings in modern scholarship, it is now firmly settled in Alopec. Another Alopec family, later allied with this one by marriage, is the house which produced Aristides, who, we are told, was in early life a heteros of Cleisthenes. Both of these parties will have had their supporters in the city. Alcibiades of Scambonidae and Leogoras of Kidathenaion, head of the other main branch of the Keraikes, could claim opposition to Pisistratus later. The Hyperacreoi are, on the face of it, the men beyond the hills, outside the Parnes Pentelicon Hymetos ring. Diacreoi, the main alternative form of their name, will come from the Diacria, which is said, on the most plausible emendation of Hesychius, to run from Parnes to Brauron. It is at Brauron itself that we can safely place their leader, Pisistratus. A Marathon further north is well within their area, and it is tempting to think that the tyrant's party landed there in 546 and 490 because they could be sure of local support. The direct arguments for Pisistrated supporters in this area are not, however, very strong. Wilamowitz thought that the Aristian who moved the decree for Pisistratus' bodyguard was the Aristian commemorated in the well-known relief from Velidanissa, who would thus have come from halfway between Brauron and Marathon. But the date of the relief is too late, and the name not uncommon. More hopeful supporters might be found in the 2 Marathonians found on Ostraca of the 480s. Of these, Butalion is a serious possibility for the missing name of the pro-tyrant ostracized in 485. The other, Habron, son of Patrocles. I was once inclined to think identical with a Habron, Archon under Hippias. In 5i8, possibly son of the Patrocles who dedicated the mid-6th century altar of Athena Nike. But Lobel has now made it highly unlikely that there was such an Archon. The case for Pisistratid supporters in Marathon must remain largely one of probability. Both of these parties will have had their supporters in the city. Alcibiades of Scambonidae and Leogoras of Kidathenaion, head of the other main branch of the Keraikes, could claim opposition to Pisistratus later. The Hyperacreoi are, on the face of it, the men beyond the hills, outside the Parnes Pentelicon Hemetos ring. Diacreoi, the main alternative form of their name, will come from the Diacria, which is said, on the most plausible emendation of Hesychius, to run from Parnes to Broron. It is at Broron itself that we can safely place their leader, Pisistratus. Marathon, further north, is well within their area, and it is tempting to think that the tyrant's party landed there in 546 and 490 because they could be sure of local support. The direct arguments for Pisistratids' supporters in this area are not, however, very strong. Wilamowitz thought that the Aristian who moved the decree for Pisistratus' bodyguard was the Aristion commemorated in the well-known relief from Velidaneza, who would thus have come from halfway between Broron and Marathon. But the date of the relief is too late, and the name not uncommon. More hopeful supporters might be found in the two Marathonians found on Ostraka of the 480s. Of these, Boutalion is a serious possibility for the missing name of the pro-tyrant ostracized in 485. The other, Hebron, son of Patrocles, I was once inclined to think identical with a Hebron, Archon under Hippias in 5i8, 517. Possibly son of the Patrocles who dedicated the mid-6th century altar of Athena Nike, but Lobel has now made it highly unlikely that there was such an Archon. The case for Pisistratids supporters in Marathon must remain largely one of probability. Hyperacreoi is, I take it, a wider term than Diacreoi, and will accommodate, besides these northeastern hills, the East Attic plain, which we now call the Mesogaea. The population of this plain must already have been substantial in the time of Cleisthenes, for the descendants of the Demesmen of 507 provided over an eighth of the 4th century Buli. It is, however, extremely short of early families of importance. The 1/6th century figure is Socrates of Paeania, father of the Phae, who played a part in Pisistratus' first return and married his son Hipparchus. Paeania lies directly on the only route from Broron to Athens. The Mesogaea has been described as the plain dominated by Broron and Marathon. This is slightly misleading. Marathon is very much tucked away behind Pentelicon, and a sharp uphill walk is needed to take one out of the marshy valley of Broron itself to the 120-meter level of the main Mesogaea. Nevertheless, it is true that, in the absence of powerful families in the plain itself, Marathon and Broron, both with important cults to serve as a focus, could exercise influence on the plain, which would tend to look east to them before it looked west to Athens. Two more families of importance remain for consideration. Since Wilamowitz, it has been normal to associate the Philades with Broron and the Hyperacreoi. The case for this has been substantially political, and the only topographical argument is that Philaeos is said to have settled at Broron, which was called Philaedae in the Cleisthenic Deme system. However, it can hardly be true that Philaeos bound his descendants to the site forever. On this argument, it would be surprising that Themistocles came from Phraarioi and not from the Lycomid center at Phlia, and in fact, the ancestors of Epicurus, the only man described as a Philade by an ancient source, lived at Gargetos, well away from Broron, in 507. There's never been any doubt that the Chaemonids, who succeeded to the position of Miltiades, son of Kypselos, lived elsewhere. Their family estates were at Lachiadae, west of Athens on the Sacred Way, and Camon, and doubtless his father, bore that Demotic. Their family tombs were at Koile, just outside the city to the southwest. They may indeed have been a different family, although it has recently been observed that it would make better sense of Miltiades' adoption of Stesagoras II if Stesagoras had also been a Philade. A neglected Pindaric Scholian even positively asserts the descent of Cimon from Aias. A stronger positive reason for detaching the Philades from Broron may be found in the story of Miltiades' meeting with the Dolonkoi. Miltiades, sitting by his front door, sees them passing and shouts his invitation, certainly not from Broron, but rather, we may confidently assert, from Lachiadae. Territorially, at any rate, the case for supposing the Philades Pediaes seems strongest. Cleisthenes' opponent, Isagoras, presents a more difficult problem. Two recent scholars have made him a Philade, largely on the strength of his father's name, Teisandros. The name appears in other families too, and the case is hardly strengthened by a mysterious brother of Miltiades RR, with a name ending in Agoras, who appears in 489. Herodotus says firmly that he does not know Isagoras' family, but that his Oyevase sacrificed to Zook. It is hard to believe that he discovered the family cults, and not the Philid blood, and even harder to believe him a deliberate liar. The best approach is probably through the family cult, but he seems to be at home in Icaria, in the Pentelicon area, whereas simple Carios, he seems to be the basic deity, beside whom Dionysus is an importation. Here too we may place the headquarters of Isagoras' Genos, though he himself may have moved elsewhere. Cleisthenes' reforms. The Dem names. Obviously, there were centers of population before Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes gave them corporate existence by making demotai and demarchoi. Aristotle notes that not all places had names, and Cleisthenes gave them names. The interesting names are those Akro Tnv Dada Mavtkov, the patronymic demi names. Some of these, for example, Butadai and Pionidai, are certainly also the names of Gene. It is not stated, and there is no probability that membership of such dems was confined to members of these Gene. It is obvious that it would be distinctly weakening to a kinship organization if the same name were given to a state unit of more open composition. One clear instance shows that this blow was felt. By the 4th century, the Genos of the Butadai, which held two of the most important Athenian priesthoods, has renamed itself the Eteobautidai, the real descendants of Bautis. If the blow was felt, it may well have been intended. The assumption that it was is strengthened when we recall the case for supposing that the Butadai had headed the Pediaes. This may not be the only case. An observation seems to show that there is a concentration of patronymic names in the likely area of the Pediaes. The game could perhaps be played both ways. That Broron was a place of importance is clear, but its name was a word of power, the epithet of Artemis Brauronia, and power to the wrong party. Broron is not the name of a Cleisthenic dem. Instead, the dem is called Philidae, an annoyance to the Philades in itself, and perhaps an attempt to foster such cult of Philios as there was away from the Philade center at Lachiadae. Territorially, the country dems would have been easy to arrange. If there was garum andering at this level, we cannot recover its details. The real problem will have Kami in the city, and here we are, still almost without evidence to determine the principles on which the dem system was arranged. The Trides. It will be helpful at this point to consider the present state of our evidence on the names of the Trides and their distribution on the map of Attica. To save space and to avoid party pre, I shall almost always follow the views of Kirsten, with the single qualification that I cannot follow his belief that it is nearly always possible to draw a neat line on the map round the territory of any individual Trides. Erechtheus. The names of the Trides are unknown. The city Trides included no true city dem, and was mostly taken from the territory of the old Paralia, without going down to the coast. Its principal dems were Euanomon and Agrial, the latter having Alcmaeonid land. The coast Trides was in South Attica, southeast of Hymettos, formed mainly of the dems of Lamtra and Anagyrus. The inland Trides was in the far northeast of the Attic plain, with Caphesia its most important element. Whether by accident or design, the Butadai, who held the hereditary priesthood of Erechtheus, were not included in this tribe, which had a priest of Erechtheus appointed by lot, Aegeus II. We have the name of one Trites, that of the inland, Epicris. The word has some history. Strabo gives Epacria as one of the 12 cities founded by Cecrops. Plutarch once uses Epacris as the name of Pisistratus' party, probably by simple confusion. And Epacria, distinct from the Cleisthenic Trites, is also attested by Philochorus. The city treaties included Kolitos, which is actually in the city, southwest of the Agora, but it also ran far enough to the northwest to take in Kolonos Hippios, and to the northeast to take in Ankylo. It seems unlikely that it was fully contiguous. The coast treaties was on the east coast, from Brauron north to Muri Nut. The inland treaties was oddly shaped, lying mostly on Pentelicon, with a long tongue south into the Mesogaea plain to include Erchia. These two treaties touch, and it is perhaps even doubtful to which treaties Ionidae and Tethras should be assigned. Pandionis, third. Here we have three treaties names, known and straightforward. The city was Cleisthenes, the coast Myrines, the inland Paeania. The city treaties included the Acropolis and therefore the shrine of Pandion, and was formed only of the Dem Kidathenion. The coast treaties was a powerful block south of Brauron, taking in part of the southeast of the Mesogaea plain. It seems to have touched the inland treaties at an angle. This treaties was composed of the north of the Mesogaea, with the exception of Erchia. The strange feature of this tribe, to which we shall return, is its inclusion of Probalinthos, which seems likely to have been at Zelocharissa, on the coast immediately south of Marathon, and separated from the rest of the coast treaties by the whole length of the coast treaties of Aigis. Leontis, therefore. We have the names of the city treaties Scambonidae and the coast treaties Phrearioi. The inland treaties, 6 letters in the genitive, evades identification. The city treaties has Scambonidae in the city itself and some of the plain to the north. Part of the northern section of the city treaties of Aigais seems to intervene. More oddly still, Halimus, well down the coast to the southeast, is completely separate from it. The coast treaties has the southern end of the east coast down to Sunion, but the territory of Thoricos is a bite taken out of it, which effectively divided it into 2. The inland treaties has the eastern slopes of Parnes and a portion of the northwest Attic plain. As will be seen, it is difficult to make Hekale on Pentelicon join it. Achamantis v. Here we begin to run into difficulties, for we have 4 treaties names. Cholargos was the name of the city treaties Cia 450, but it is difficult to see how IG 12883 Cia 420 can be restored as anything but. Kappa, the coast treaties, was Thoricos. The inland treaties, Sphetos. On the face of it, the city treaties was renamed between 450 and 420. These 2 names reflect its mixed composition. Karamis was certainly at least partly in the city. The rest of the treaties was a part of the plain, including Cholargos. Unless one draws one's lines in a very arbitrary manner, the treaties was certainly split. The coast treaties only contained the Dem of Thoricos. The inland treaties had the whole of the south Mesogaea, except Myrines, Oineus. 6. Here we have 2 certain treaties names, Lachiadae and Tulriasioi, presumably the city and coast treaties. A third appears on 2 stones which appear to confirm each other in the restorations. This was healed by Wade Gary to be the inland treaties, but he felt the difficulty of this view, since the inland treaties was composed entirely of the Dem of Achernae, and Thucydides seems to draw a distinction between Achernae and the Pedion. One cannot exclude the possibility suggested to me by Mr. Forrest that this is a case analogous to Plilidae, a stroke of malice on Cleisthenes' part, putting the Tritis Pedicis there. There were manifestly no PDIs in the party sense. However, the discovery of a name change in Achamantis opens another possibility here. For of the 2 stones which give the evidence for Pediaes, one is certainly, the other possibly, earlier than the stone which gives Lachiadae. A solution which makes Pediaes an earlier name for Lachiadae seems more attractive. For this city treaties will be the heart of Pediaes country, the plain west of Athens towards Korydallos, reaching Athens along the sacred Wve through Lachiadae and Budidae. The coast treatise is only partly coast. It includes the eastern part of the Thriasian plain, but reaches right up onto Parnes to include Philae. The inland Trides, as we have seen, is only composed of the dem of a Harnai. Kekropis, 7th. The Trides names are unknown. The city Trides was composed of Zypete and Melit, which cannot be made to join. The coast Trides was south of Hymettos, and mostly the territory of Ixone. The inland Trides is geographically uneven, with parts of the northeast Attic plain and southwest Pentelicon. Hippothontus, 8th. One inscription gives us two Trides names, Piraeus for the city, Eleusis for the coast. Another, much earlier, gives us a third name, a long one, beginning with T's or Z. Wade Gary, to whom we owe the restoration, assigned this automatically to the inland Trides. But no suitable restoration is available, and the possibility of a change of name allows the chance that this may be another name for the city or coast Trides. A new suggestion is possible, and the argument may lead us to one. The city Trides was Piraeus, with the land west along the coast, and Koile in the city itself. It may be possible to join these elements, but it hardly seems necessary. The coast Trides is Eleusis, and the west of the Telriasian plain, but it goes up onto Parnes to include Oinoi. The inland Trides is the extreme east of Parnes, Decelia, Svendale, and Oion, very widely spread in an area of thin population. The tribal center, the Hippotalhantian, was, abnormally, not in Athens, but in Eleusis. Iantis, 19. Here we have one name for the coast Trides, Tetrapolius. The city Trides was composed of Phaleron alone. The coast Trides will be discussed later. The inland Trides was in the hills east of Parnest, mostly the territory of Aphidna. The tribal center was not in the tribe at all, but at the Eurysakian in Melite of Kekropis. Antiochus, Erex. Here we have two Trides names, Allopeke for the city, Paline for the inland, Anaplilaistos, Hyas, been plausibly suggested for the coast. The city Trides was composed of Allopeke alone. The coast Trides lay in South Attica, running inland from the west coast of Cape Sunion. The oddly shaped inland Trides covers the Pentelicon Hymettos gap. Its center was Paline, which blocks that gap. In this survey, we have on the whole assumed that our evidence, which is mainly 4th century, is valid for Cleisthenes' reform. We should note that not much of our evidence for the tribal affiliation of Demes is earlier than 450, although some of our evidence for the affiliation of Trides is earlier. We have seen some reason to believe that some Trides were renamed between 450 and 420, but I do not think that this should deter us from employing the only available working hypothesis that there was no major reorganization. Such a reorganization should not in any case be inferred from the manuscript reading of which seems to assert that there were only 100 Dems in the time of Cleisthenes. It is indeed theoretically possible that splitting will have increased the number of Demes, but the reverse process will have had to apply to Iantis, which never had more T-6 dames, the anomalies. It should now be clear that Cleisthenes did not just draw lines on the map. Such lines are difficult to draw and break down notably in the city. Why the city is organized as it is, we cannot tell, and our questions will produce few profitable answers. Our best line of approach is through the anomalies outside the city, Dems which appear to be enclaves, detached from their Trides. If we can gain some insight into the reasons for these anomalies, we may find that we have some light on the reform as a whole. There seem to be three notable enclaves worth discussion: Probalinthos, Hekale, and Halimus. For Probalinthos, the explanation seems clear, and Kirsten has already in part given it. One of the cities of Kekrops was the Tetrapolis, which continued to exist as a separate territorial cult organization, sending independent embassies to Delphi and Delos, down to the 1st century BC. It was composed of the 4 units, Marathon, Oinoe, Tricorinthos, and Probalinthos. These demes will have been fairly close together, and a suitable site for Probalinthos has been found at Xylocarissa, confirmed by 2 gravestones and a dedication. The antiquity and deep roots of this organization are confirmed by the list of its sacrifices. a body which sacrifices to Nesvtm and a succession of nameless heroes and heroines, is not an artificial construction, but the unit formed by these four demes will not only have been territorially compact, but also paisastrated territory. Efficiency will demand that it has to be some kind of administrative unit. It can even be called the Trides of the Tetrapolis. What could be done, however, and was done, was to detach from it the prosperous deme of Probalintlios, providing 5 bulutai in the 4th century, and to attach Rhamnus, which had totally different cults and doubtless different traditions. Probalinthos is detail HCD, but it is attached not to the contiguous coast Trides of Aegeus, but to the more distant coast Trides of Pandionis. The only explanation can be that there is little point in detackling it from Marathon in order to attach it to the Trides which contains Brauron. In its detachment from both, it becomes an enclave, separating the two centers of paisastrated influence. Here on a larger scale, we see the same mind at work as we saw with the Botidae. The traditional unit remains and keeps its name, but by its side, we'll have a new unit, imposed from outside, with the same name, but of different composition. Even this may not have been felt to be enough, and there is an indication that steps may have been taken to improve the political situation. For by shortly after 490, it is possible to appoint at Marathon to supervise a festival 30 men, representing each of the 10 tribes. The ambiguity of the word allows the possibilities either that these are visitors for the festival or that they are new settlers, perhaps on confiscated property, who have come to Marathon since the Cleisthenic reforms. The second case is Hecale. Its site is a problem. It is somewhere near the Tetrapolis, on the road from Athens to Marathon, which probably puts it somewhere on Pentelicon, and certainly well away from any part of Leontis. It has been proposed to put it at Koukounari on the north side of Pentelicon, where in fact the sacrificial calendar of the Tetrapolis was found. But Hecale is not part of the Tetrapolis, and although Theseus stayed there on his way to fight the Marathonian bull, it is not stated that the Tetrapolis took part in the Hecalesia, nor do Hecale or Zeu Exoclato appear on the Tetrapolis calendar, which is admittedly incomplete. It is probably better to see in Koukounari merely a cult spot on a hill, and I see no real reason to deny that Hecale is at or near the present village of the name, southwest west of Koukounari, but still in the north-northwest of Pentelicon. This is still far from Leontis, and the reason for detaching it from the nearby inland Trides of Aegaeus, Kekropis, and Antiochus must be its importance as a cult center. If we knew which were who celebrated the Hecalesia, we would find them in these Trides. The suspicion that deliberate interference has been at work in drawing the Trides boundaries in this part of the world is strengthened by a consideration of the shapes of these Trides, all distinctly malformed. The political motive may well lie in the position of Isagoras. We have already seen grounds for placing him in Icaria. There, as at Botidae, a non-Cleisthenic organization survived side by side with the Deme. The Cleisthenic Trides, to which it belonged, retained the name Epicrates. We do not know the home or domain of Zeu, but here again, we may suspect that territory is removed from it, and that non-Epicria territory, Erchia, is brought in from the plain below. The third anomaly, Halimus, has been explained by Kirsten as belonging not to the city Trides of Leontis, but to the inland Trides. The Dem, it is said, is composed of Alcmeonid supporters from near Leipzidrian, who moved after 507 to Alcmeonid land, retaining their old Trides affiliation. However, the arrangement of a Prytani list suggests fairly strongly that the Dem belongs to the city Trides, and there is no evidence that Alcmeonid land came down to the coast, for the territory of Euonomen is in the way. No clear answer can be given. This is an area of old settlement, with a very primitive Demeter cult on Cape Colias. Perhaps here too there is a desire to detach a cult site from its neighborhood. Other religious organizations. The anomalies have indeed provided us with a clue which suggests that it may be profitable to investigate the effect of the reforms on other religious organizations of a territorial character. Let us begin with the tetrachomoi. It is possible that they, like the tetrapoles, figured in Strabo's list of the 12 cities of Cecrops, a list which certainly reflects some truth about early Attica. One name is missing, and the conjecture that their name has dropped out after that of the tetrapolis is a plausible one. However this may be, the antiquity of their cult of Heracles is not in doubt. The four components are given by Pollux as Piraeus, Phaleron, Xipete, and Thymetae. The most likely interpretation of a 4th century inscription shows Phaleron still possessing a organization, and in 330-329, they still joined in a festival. They are therefore a real unit with something in common. It is therefore interesting to find that Cleisthenes' reforms leave them in 3 different trities, Xipete going to Cecropis, Phaleron to Iantis, Piraeus, and Thymetae to Hippothontus. It is reasonable to suppose that the splitting was intentional. We may go a stage further and recall that Hippothontus has a treatise with an unrestored long name beginning with T or Z. It seems not unlikely that this should be an earlier name for the Piraeus treatise, which contains 2 of the old tetrachomon. The parallel with the tetrapolis would not be exact, since the Cleisthenic tetrapolis really contained 4 demes, and the Cleisthenic tetrachomon should have at least 5: Piraeus, Thymetae, Koile, Cariadae, and Korydallos. Either the word tetrachomoi would not be felt to have numerical significance, or perhaps we should regard Cariadae or Korydallos as a splinter deme of later origin. Pallene is the other main candidate for the missing city of Cecrops, but the League of Athena Palenis presents greater problems since its composition cannot be precisely determined. The dedication quoted by Athenaeus gives us 3 member demes with relative certainty, Pallene itself, Gargetos and Pythos, and the quotation from Themison which follows assures us that there were a number of member demes. Schleifer adds Aclernite to these from the quotation from the LCO Vo lot, which lies between these passages. But this seems an unnecessary addition, of no great topographical probability. It seems more likely that Athenaeus is simply quoting from Polemon, a number of passages bearing on parasites. Some of these certainly have nothing to do with Athena Palenis, and I would add the passage on Acharnai to their number. Even so, we are left with a cult league centered at Pallene, with the names of at least 3 dems which belong to it. Under the Cleisthenic system, there was a treatise named Pallene of elongated shape, from which Gargetos and Pythos were excluded. This seems to conform well to the pattern which we have established. The trichomoi, on the other hand, present a different picture. Their 3 members, Euperidae, Cropidae, and Peleches, are all in the same treatise. We know virtually nothing of the unit, but may surmise from its situation and the lack of references that it was of little importance. Nothing of importance emerges from an examination of the mesogeoil of the paraloi, attractive though their names are in this context. Some minor points may be briefly noted. Kirsten may be right to see significance in the isolation of the ancient city of Thorikos. There is some tendency to detach old cults of the tribal eponymoi from those tribes. The case of Erechtheus is clear. An ancient cult of Leos is attested at Hagnus, which is nevertheless excluded from Leontis. Similarly, Erechtheis, Cecropis, and Iantis have to go outside their tribes to worship their tribal hero, although Pandionus, centered on the Acropolis, and Hippothontus do not. Units to compete with them and to destroy the influence which they gained from possessing a common cult in a common locality. Modern scholarship has tended to neglect the treaties, seeing in them mere devices to ensure mixed composition of the tribes. This is an understandable tendency, since in the event the tribes won a success which can only be described as surprising, while the treaties totally failed to compete with the older local organizations. There was a parallel failure in Cleisthenes' attempt to redefine the qualifications for citizenship. He put the dem beside the fratry but could not persuade the Athenians that phratry membership was of no importance. Pericles had to recognize this basic unwillingness to accept the substitute. However, the fact that the Trites failed to establish themselves as local units does not mean that they were not intended to have importance. The mass of 5th century Heroi from the Agora and from the Piraeus indicates that they were intended to serve real purposes. The purposes are indeed mysterious. Rabacek has recently suggested uses for the Agora markers. The Piraeus Heroi presumably served as muster stations on the lines that Demosthenes was trying to revive as late as 354. The division of the Prytanes into Trites survived into the time of the Ath-Poleonshire, and the Epimeletae of the tribes were selected by Trites in the 4th century. The Trites retained property and cults. Another substantial reason for modern depreciation of the Trites has been their apparent random distribution on the map of Attica. Little attention has been paid to the enclaves, but a great deal of attention has been given to the contrary situation where blocks appear to have been left untouched by the redistribution. The importance of these blocks can be overstressed. As Ehrenberg has said, Cleisthenes was interested in people, not territory. But even the territorial arguments lose some of their force when examined on a contoured map. Let us work through a recent list of Telhis blocks. It is not true that the inland and coast Trites of Achamantis join. Thorikos is an enclave in Leontis, and the territory of Phraarioi lies between it and Kepelhael, the nearest point of the inland Trites. In Pandionis, the coast and inland Trites touch at a point, not at a line, and the center of population of the inland Trites is at Paeania, far to the west. In Aegaeus, the Trites are contiguous, but they are quite different in character. The coast Trites is composed of coast towns and plain. The inland Trites is mostly hill and has been deliberately deformed. The case which is invariably quoted is that of Iantis, where a flat map shows a solid northeastern block. This, of course, was the case which made Belloc suspect Pacistratid influence, and a solid Pacistratid block in the northeast would contradict the general drift of our inquiry. But the case does not hold, either territorially or politically. The center of population for the inland Trites is at Aphidna, well up in the hills, a long and tedious climb from Marathon, while the evidence for interference with the composition of the coast Trites is clear. Politically, it may indeed be true that Marathon remains a center of Pacistratid influence. Can this really be the case with Aphidna, where we know of two leading families, the Gephiraioi, the family of Harmodios, and Callimachos, the Polemarch, who led the Athenians at Marathon? If Iantis was a Pacistratid-packed tribe, they had forgotten it by the time they led the right wing in 490. There is indeed a certain contiguity of Trites, but this is to be expected if the Trites were, as we are told, assigned to the tribes by lot. Provided that the Trites were properly constructed in themselves, any random allocation would do. The only necessary qualification was that each tribe should have a city, a coast, and an inland. The Trites cut across the most obvious local loyalties. It could be left to Apollo to create the tribes, to produce the wider loyalties to be implanted when men served together on the Bulli, and, more importantly, in the army. In the event, the men of Phaleron fought side by side with those of Marathon and Aphidna, and Leontis united Sunion, Scambonidae, and eastern Parnes. Eleusis, Charames, and Aphidna might have been better still, but the lot would produce adequate results, and in fact, it taught the right lessons. Cleisthenes. We have left some parts of the reform in the dark for want of evidence. This lack comes partly from the paradox I began with. We know about local cults because they survived because Cleisthenes failed with them. Other institutions did not retain their hold, and we know so little of the old tribes, the old Trites, and the old Naucraries, that our picture may have been substantially distorted. The Naucraries in particular may well have had territorial implications, and Cleisthenes does not seem to have abolished them. But there are other patches of darkness. Some have recently seen in Cleisthenes' moves a desire to end the old threefold distinction of caste. Lumeni have found the evidence that Cleisthenes desired to bring in new citizens unconvincing. Perhaps most important of all, we have next to no evidence on the confiscation and redistribution of land in 6th century Athens. The two things which emerge most clearly are an attack on organizations which held a locality by religious ties, some of them in areas attached to political opponents of Cleisthenes, and an attempt to unify Attica by making men from different areas work and fight together. How far was Cleisthenes a politician? How far a statesman? The Alcmaeonids in the 6th century had been caught between the fires of the autochthonous landed population of the plain, secure in the possession of the most important state cults, and their fellow Pylian Pisistratus, who in the east had built himself a remarkable coalition of varied interests, and had secured himself in the tyranny by promoting economic prosperity and by giving Athena wider appeal without the aid of her traditional guardians. The Alcmaeonids possessed no important local cult of their own that we know of. Their power rested solely on land and wealth, which they buttressed by looking outside Athens to Delphi, Sicyon, and Lydia. In the struggle for power before Pisistratus, they had been squeezed out and forced to rely on their position outside Athens. Cleisthenes had watched this process under his father Megacles, and Megacles' successor, his uncle Alcmaeonides. The veering of tyrannical favor, which brought him home and to the archonship in 525, made no essential difference to the lesson. He had learnt the power of local cults and the value of a wider Athens. When he came home finally in 510, the position had been transformed by Pisistratus and his sons. New classes had been given economic hope, and men had learnt to look to Athens as the undisputed center. There were features here which he may well have disliked, and which were certainly disliked by other men of power. Aten Kiai, cut into the tyrants' enfranchisements. Other moves may have cut into their land distributions. Cleisthenes' main opponent came from Pentelicon, deriving strength from the close-knit religious unions of that area, perhaps from the prestige of the new dramatic festivals of Icaria. Cleisthenes had Delphi behind him, but so far, Delphi had only been of use as a lever to bring in Sparta, and Cleomenes of Sparta backed Isagoras. Isagoras, with Spartan backing and using the methods of the 560s, won the upper hand. If there was to be a place for the Alcmaeonids in Athens, new methods had to be used. One lesson could be learned from the tyrants, and Cleisthenes turned to the demos, which the tyrants had created and favored, which he and other dynasts had previously rejected. It is hard to see how the complexities of the reforms could have been used in themselves as a bargaining counter to win the demos. Even at the lowest level, the prospect of local self-government in the dem. Something more concrete will have been in the heir citizenship, probably also land. Land hunger remains strong in Athens for the next 15 years or so. Salamis, Chalkis, and Lemnos all are attempts to meet a need which Cleisthenes could only partly satisfy in Attica, since land to satisfy it could only come from his opponents, not from his supporters. At this point, constitutional problems have been multiplied. How could the reforms have been put through while Isagoras was archon, able as presiding officer to block a vote? Was Cleisthenes an archon? Did he hold a special commission? How could he have obtained a majority if his supporters had been disfranchised? These problems seem irrelevant to a revolutionary situation. Whether Isagoras was in the chair or not, whether the Neapolitae were legally entitled to vote or not, there was nothing to prevent them carrying clubs and standing round, or even on the pinnacles to shout, "All power to the 10 tribes." Cleisthenes needed a new system. The creation of the dem met this difficulty, but there still remained the problem of local vested interests. This could be met by establishing the trities, which might curtail the powers of local organizations. The real problem came in deciding how to crown the pyramid, how to ensure that the new local units served interests wider than local ones, and looked to Athens in the way Pisistratus had shown. The 4 Ionian tribes seem now to have represented very little. Changing tribal organization was not unparalleled in the 6th century. Cleisthenes' own grandfather, Cleisthenes of Sicyon, had changed tribe names and may have created a new tribe from the underprivileged. At any rate, He had a tribe for the previously underprivileged and asserted the principle that it was better than the others. At Cyrene, Demonax of Mantinea had acted rather differently. Finding the original settlers organized in the three Dorian tribes and the newcomers not organized at all, he created a new three-tribe system on ethnic lines. These systems had given new citizens or settlers rights, but retained the seeds of difference and dissension. Cleisthenes realized that there was no possibility of peace and concord without mixing his disparate elements. The novelty of his solution lies in its determination to make a fresh start. All citizens, old and new, would start equal in his new dems and new tribes. This is his most important service to Athens. Traditionally, and perhaps temperamentally, averse to tyranny, he found a way to create a pyramid of power which would have at its head, at least in theory, the people and not one person, and which would maintain the unifying force generated by the tyranny without a tyranny's disadvantages. The way he chose had distinct advantages for himself and his family. The details of his settlement could be and were manipulated to the disadvantage of traditional opponents. But the nature of the Alcmaeonid position was such that it could not be affected by this settlement. The treaties lines were drawn to leave Alcmaeonids in at least 3 different tribes, a result which might well prove fatal to a family which depended for influence on the control of a local cult, but which could be positively welcomed by a family of land and wealth, which acquired the opportunity to have a hand in the affairs of 3 of the new tribes. But it cannot be denied that, politician though he was, Cleisthenes was capable of seeing the advantages of Attic unity. Would have been the key word in his thought, as it was in the language of his most sympathetic commentator.